Over time, technology and training in the military has advanced and adapted to present-day situations. Whether it's better or worse for recruits now is the question. Captain Lee McQueen said that in the past, drill sergeants used to be able to discipline soldiers on the spot when they misbehaved, but now you can't even touch them to check their ammunition, and his argument that basic training in the military now has gone soft. Soldiers who went through basic training around 1940 to 1980 also agreed that training now is lacking strict discipline. In Lieutenant Colonel Scott Powers' view, he is not impressed with leaders who think they have to abuse their soldiers to train them to standard, or leaders who think the lack of abuse makes basic training soft. In another point of view, Captain Corey Whitehead, commander of the Great Lakes Boot Camp, says that the old method of getting right in your face and screaming and hollering sends recruits running. By saying they're hungry for standards and if they're given one, they embrace it, he further backs up his argument that trainees are more motivated by standards than strict verbal demands. The difference between strict standards and yelling is that being more strict holds recruits to higher standards and are expected to be more mature and soldierly, while yelling is a negative way to enforce expectations upon trainees, which also doesn't make them feel as motivated to do what is asked of them. Have the changes in military training from demanding physical training to more mental training been beneficial, or have they somehow decreased the performance soldiers would have in combat today? Based on several factors such as technological advances and military training, the military's perspective of resilience has changed for the better. Something that interested me to learn about resiliency and how it's taught in the military is Laura Hillenbrand's book Unbroken. Her book was also made into a movie with the help of the main character Louis Zamperini himself. It's about Zamperini's life as it evolved from a troublemaking childhood attitude to becoming an Olympic runner and on to being a POW in World War II. Holding on to his faith in God significantly helped him when it came to surviving hardships he had to face, such as beatings by camp officers along with living in bad conditions physically and environmentally. Military resilience now is far different from the military resilience people had back in World War II and focuses more on the mental health of recruits than whether or not they will make it through basic training. In Laura Hillenbrand's book, Louis' brother Pete said if you can take it, you can make it, and Louis maintains that a moment of pain is worth a lifetime of glory. Louis had to overcome many obstacles in his life, whether it was winning a track race, being able to compete in the 1940 Summer Olympics in Tokyo, Japan, which ended up being canceled due to the outbreak of World War II, or becoming a prisoner of war, or POW, and having to find ways to survive in the worst conditions. Throughout his journey as a POW, he found ways to survive through strong mental stability, which positively impacted his chances of survival. The resilience he built and discipline he learned from his childhood to his young adult years overall helped him later in the war in ways that anyone would have, by thinking of his family and using distractions like his mother's cooking or thinking of his brother coaching him to make a better life for himself. Back then, training was much more physically based and motivated. In an article called Boot Camp Goes Soft by Mark Thompson, Captain Lee McQueen's team of drill sergeants, delegated to whip raw recruits into shape, spent an afternoon walking a course looking more like a slow-mo replay of an NFL game than the cutting edge of the 21st century U.S. Army. McQueen states that there wasn't any training value in walking the course, and his colleague, Private Jerry Burnell, said he expected basic training to be tough like the movies, but this was more like a summer camp. Since basic used to be more physical with men and women, trainees had to be put through much worse obstacles than just simply walking their training course. No one who went through boot camp in the 1950s or 60s would recognize the place today. Soldiers in training have swapped combat boots for sneakers and fatigues for gym shorts and t-shirts. Instead of running in formation, they run at their own pace to challenge the speedy and avoid injuring the slower trainees. In military obstacle courses, they can run around instead of over some walls, and in some quarters the very phrase obstacle course is frowned upon as too harsh, and for the Navy, confidence course is now the preferred term. In a different article called Army Changes Basic Training for the First Time in 30 Years, Lieutenant General Hertling said that the current generation has computer skills and knowledge base vital to a modern fighting force, and foresees soldiers using specially equipped cell phones to retrieve information on the battlefield to help repair a truck or carry out an emergency life-saving medical technique. His colleague, Captain Scott Sewell, also stated that most of these soldiers have never been in a fistfight or any kind of physical confrontation, and are stunned when they get smacked in the face while overseeing almost 190 trainees in their third week of training. We are trying to get them to act and to think like warriors. For hours, Sewell and his drill sergeants urge on helmeted trainees as they wail away at each other with sticks, landing head and body blows until one falls flat on the ground. As a victor slams away at his flattened foe, a drill sergeant whistles the fight to a halt. My grandfather, David Dunnigan, told me that when he was in basic training for Vietnam, everyone would have to go through some type of realistic obstacle course that included crawling under a barbed wire with live rounds going off right above them, so if you simply stood up or quit, we would fail that phase of training. While doing these obstacle courses, the people who were training recruits would watch how you got through each obstacle under high levels of intensity and pressure to determine where you would go after this phase. Sometimes, he said, they would have several courses in areas we didn't know about and make us do them occasionally more than once if we didn't pass the first attempt, and if they didn't have us do it again, we would fail that phase of training and would not be able to move forward with soldiers that passed. He also said that since their trainers watched them do these courses and be placed in intensely realistic combat situations, he felt more pressure to get through it because he knew he needed to for the sake of completing his training. It gave trainers specific details of how people went through these obstacles to determine which field they would be in as well, because it was the most effective and realistic way of finding out how the trainee would be in combat. The services are under increasing pressure to stem a high dropout rate among trainees. One way to do that is to make basic training easier for everyone to complete. The number of recruits who wash out after fewer than 6 months, which is how long it takes most members of the service to complete basic plus some advanced training, has climbed by a third over the past decade. What we're ending up with is a kinder, gentler drill sergeant who's trying to keep attrition down, says Charles Mascos, a leading military sociologist at Northwestern University. But these kind of instructors are not necessarily creating the kind of force you want to go to war. However, others might argue, well, what's wrong with the older training techniques, or why are the newer techniques being frowned upon? Although the military denies it, many male soldiers and outside experts also believe that mingling men and women in boot camp, as the Air Force has done since 1977, the Navy since 1992, and the Army since 1994, leads to relaxed standards of physical performance and sexual tensions that diminish boot camp's effectiveness. I've researched how people in the military train soldiers to become more resilient through cognitive therapy of depression, which involves helping soldiers recognize the most catastrophic thoughts they will expect to come across in combat. This cognitive therapy also teaches recruits to discard such thoughts completely in order to allow more productive actions and thoughts to motivate them to move forward in combat eventually without hesitation. One of the main purposes of resiliency training in the military is not to break recruits, but to instead build them up from the beginning of their training to where they will end up after their basic training. Resiliency training has the potential to make mental health less severe, serious, or painful when provided during initial military training. The present study examined the impact of resiliency training on U.S. soldier well-being and attitudes during basic combat training. Platoons were randomly assigned to resilience training and military history provided during the first few days of basic training. Surveys were conducted at baseline, post-intervention, and 3, 6, and 9 weeks. The sample resulted in a total of 1,939 soldiers who completed at least the baseline and one follow-up survey. There were no significant differences between conditions in terms of depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, or sleep problems. However, while anxiety decreased in both conditions, the rate of decrease was faster in the resilience training condition. In contrast, resilience training had a slower rate of increase in group cohesion over time than the military history condition. In addition, resilience training was associated with greater confidence in helping others and received more positive ratings than military history. Fundamentally, resilience training is designed to teach individuals evidence-informed skills promoting mental health, to prevent the development of symptoms and adjustment problems, and to enhance adaptation. The importance of mental fitness is going to be just as important, if not more, than physical fitness when it comes to updated resiliency training in the military. The resilience training is part of comprehensive soldier fitness, also known as CSF, which focuses on the 5 dimensions of strength: emotional, social, spiritual, family, and physical. As people develop their holistic fitness strength, they develop psychological resilience to not only bounce back, but to thrive under challenging conditions, said General Rhonda Cornum, CSF Director. We've been working for about the last year on comprehensive soldier fitness, said General George W. Casey, Jr., Chief of Staff of the Army. It's designed to bring mental fitness up to the same level that we give to physical fitness. In this era of persistent conflict, we found that the vast majority of soldiers deploying have a positive growth experience because they're exposed to something very difficult and succeed. Our goal through comprehensive soldier fitness is to ensure that all soldiers have the skills to grow and succeed. The boot camp survival training for recruits, also known as the bootstrap intervention, was designed to reduce emotional reactivity and improve cognitive behavioral coping strategies in at-risk recruits. Those completing bootstrap scored higher on measures of well-being and were more likely to complete basic training than those in control condition. For most of this century, basic training was a deliberately harsh introduction to military life, a daily dose of screaming drill sergeants dishing out vulgarity and physical intimidation to mortify and motivate trainees. These days, drill sergeants spend more time mentoring than menacing. We're no longer the charge to the beach, stogie in the mouth, cussing, hard-drinking, women-chasing World War II guy, says Senior Master Sergeant Paula Burns, who supervises basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. As the military's technology has grown more sophisticated, the need for traditional warriors trained in traditional ways has waned. The more technologically advanced we get, says Burns, the less overly brutal we need to be. In mid-January of this year, my dad and I went to Chris Tonto Paranto's presentation on his book and movie called 13 Hours, The Inside Account of What Really Happened in Benghazi by Mitchell Zukoff with his Annex security team. In the presentation, he talked about how accurate the movie was to what happened in real life and his personal experiences with resilience in combat during the attacks in Libya. Paranto's lecture included how his resilience helped him through combat and how his connections to his faith pushed him to keep fighting, whether it was in general combat or his personal mental health. He said that when he and his brothers in the Annex were fighting, God's still out there taking care of us and allows us to find beauty in everything if we allow ourselves to, and that if you know there's God, nothing's going to hurt you. Paranto's nickname Tonto comes from the fact that on his team were 2 Navy SEALs and 3 Marines, and he was the only Army Ranger or Lone Ranger. And if you've seen the movie The Lone Ranger, Johnny Depp's character's name is Tonto. Something mentioned in 13 Hours along with Paranto's presentation was how he was the wild one of the 6 men stationed in Libya. He found comedy in all combat and always remembered that there's beauty in all combat as well, which affected his personality and outlook on the situation greatly and pushed him and his tight team to keep fighting and keep moving forward. John F. Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," in his inaugural address in 1961, and the main idea of Chris's story was that you have to do what is right for the country no matter what. Being wild in combat is important as well as bittersweet in Tonto and Zamperini's stories because you can't control everything besides yourself and how you react to certain situations like having to stare the line between life and death in the face constantly in war. Tonto also stated towards the end of his presentation, "My mom and dad probably don't want to hear this, but I wanted to put a bullet in my head, and you guys saved me," referring back to the support he's earned from his country and the audience at this lecture, and stated that the support really makes this the greatest country in the world.